Okay, and we're live, and we're back here, and this time with Steve Millidge from Payara, who will talk about GlassFish 6, a compatible Jakarta EE9 implementation. And for those who doesn't have a GlassFish, this is GlassFish, right, Steve? So take it home.
Okay. So that said, I'm Steve Millidge from Payara. I'll be doing a presentation on GlassFish 6, a Jakarta EE9 implementation. So I'm the founder of Payara. Payara obviously is an application server, open source application server company. I'm also a member of the PMC for the EE4J project. The EE4J project is the main project that does the implementation projects and the API. So that's the open source side. I'm also co-lead of Jakarta EE9 release. That's with Kevin Sutter from IBM. I'm mainly focusing in that on getting GlassFish out there as the compatible implementation for the Jakarta EE9 release. So I'm co-lead on GlassFish. And I'm a steering committee member. I'm also was heading up getting Jakarta concurrency out and Jakarta connectors out. And in generally, I'm a committer on a lot of the projects. So I'm been heavily involved on the Jakarta EE9 release. So what we're going to talk about now, I'm going to basically recap again what's in Jakarta EE9. I'll then explain really about what is the role of GlassFish in Jakarta EE. So, where does GlassFish fit in? It's no longer the reference implementation, so I'll sort of cover some of that as well. I'll then go into a little bit about how we built GlassFish 6. Because, with the namespace change, it'll basically sort of discuss our approach, how we went for it, what the problems we encountered. Because obviously GlassFish is a very, very big application that was obviously in the JavaX namespace. So we'll be basically looking at how we approach that. And then I'll have a little bit about how to change your code. I know there's other presentations about how you can migrate applications into the new namespace. Well, I'll do a quick demo of doing that on GlassFish 6. And then I've got a little bit about what's next for GlassFish with Jakarta 9.1 and 10 and some ideas around that. Okay, so Jakarta, first I'm going to cover what's in Jakarta EE9. It's probably been covered by a lot of other people, but it's good to recap from a GlassFish perspective. So just go backwards a little bit. What was in Jakarta EE8? Obviously, a lot of the road to Jakarta EE9 was actually first getting GlassFish through. First, we had to get compatibility with Java EE8 within Eclipse. So we built a version of GlassFish 5, GlassFish 5.1, that had full compatibility with Java EE8 and passed the Java EE8 TCK's platform specification using the Oracle TCKs. The next step for the evolution of moving Java EE through to the Eclipse Foundation was to actually release Jakarta EE8. So Jakarta EE8 was designed to be basically binary compatible with Java EE8. So it was fully compatible with EE8. The difference being, though, that the specification documents, the TCKs, the process, the implementations, etc., were all based from the Eclipse Foundation and were all open specifications under open source licenses. So this was a key step, really. This sort of proves that Jakarta EE8 is effectively equivalent to Java EE8. And we released the GlassFish implementation, which is 5.1, Eclipse GlassFish 5.1, which was then a compatible implementation of Jakarta EE8. So this basically gave us a full transparent version of GlassFish, transparent as in open source. There are also a lot of other implementations that came along with Jakarta EE8. We've got a big set now. So obviously Eclipse GlassFish is the one I've been heavily involved in, and also Payara Server 5 as well. So having Jakarta EE8 as an open source standard also enabled the Payara team to basically release Payara as a compatible implementation. So Jakarta EE8 was, basically moving Java EE8 into open source. So as I said, we started with GlassFish 5.0 from Oracle. That was Java EE8 compatible. We moved to Eclipse GlassFish 5.1. So all the source code for GlassFish was moved over into the Eclipse Foundation, donated by Oracle. Then basically Eclipse GlassFish 5.1 was built from Eclipse sources, released under the Eclipse license, and was seen to be compatible with Java EE8. We then spent a lot of time sort of releasing Java EE8 as Jakarta EE8, which again, as I said, is about moving Java EE into open source specifications, open source APIs, open source licensing, and open source process. Again, we looked at releasing a different version of Eclipse GlassFish, but essentially we didn't need to. So Eclipse GlassFish 5.1 is both Java EE8 and Jakarta EE8 compatible or compliant, and therefore that sort of shows that they are binary compatible, binary equivalents between Jakarta EE and Java EE. Then we move on to Eclipse GlassFish 6. So Eclipse GlassFish 6 is targeted as a compatible implementation of Jakarta EE9. So EE9 essentially is the move of the JavaX namespace to Jakarta namespace. So what we did, I was part of the team putting together the sort of release plan, and the release plan was really focused around just the namespace change. Really, that was just to make sure that we could target tooling vendors and applications wouldn't have to be too worried about changes in behavior and changes in specifications between EE8 and EE9. So basically EE9 is the same as EE8, but it's in the Jakarta namespace. There's some other things that we wanted to do. We wanted to remove unwanted or deprecated specifications. So really take out things that were old, not really used anymore, or used rarely or unsupported by many of the applications servers. Really, that was to lower the barrier of entry. We want more implementations to be able to be certified as compatible. So to do that, we need to remove a lot of the old stuff that people may have to implement to get compatibility. So you don't really want to force people to use the old deployment APIs, for example, which were removed, to be able to certify as a compatible implementation. The second really goal for Jakarta EE9 was to set a platform for innovation. We wanted EE9 to be the same as 8, but in the new namespace, because it's a big breaking change. But at that point, now we're done, then EE9 becomes that platform to move forward for innovation. And that means looking forward to EE10. And again, having just the namespace change and removal of some old things means that it should be easy to migrate an application from one version to the next, from EE8 to EE9. The other thing we really focused on is EE9 being like a tool release. Because of the namespace change, there's huge amounts of upstream or downstream, depending how you think of it, components that rely on the JavaX namespace that need to move to the Jakarta namespace. So things like Archillion connectors, Maven plugins, OSGI, Spring, lots of things that would depend on JavaX, need to move to Jakarta. And making the change for EE9 small is, from a features perspective, means that there's no surprises, no gotchas. So that's the focus on EE9. So where does GlassFish sit within the Jakarta EE? Because previously in Java EE, GlassFish was what was called a reference implementation. And reference implementations don't exist in Jakarta EE. So the big difference really, as I said, for Jakarta EE is it's a set of open specifications. As it's shown on here, Java EE had one normative reference implementation. And what that meant was that if there was sort of ambiguity in the specification about what behavior was correct, then GlassFish was the normative implementation. You would check it in GlassFish, and whatever GlassFish did was correct. That's gone with Jakarta EE. So there's no special implementation in Jakarta EE. So GlassFish is not special as it was in Java EE. It's one of more compatible implementations. So a compatible implementation of the spec is anything that passes the TCK and the platform specification. So basically, when you create a specification project within the Eclipse Foundation, that project has to create these orange deliverables. Well, it has to have all these things available to actually be signed off and voted and balloted. So we need a document, we need an API jar, we need a TCK, and we need a compatible implementation that passes the TCK and implements all the open source components, and implements all the optional components of that specification. And you need the Java docs. So where GlassFish 6 sits is essentially that is the implementation we are using to release the Jakarta EE platform specification, because it basically is a compatible implementation that passes the TCKs and it implements all the optional portions of the platform specification. So that's APIs that may be old, or maybe other implementations don't want to implement. For the specification to be released, we have to be able to prove that all those optional components are testable, and therefore to release the spec, you need to have an implementation that implements all those optional pieces. And for Jakarta EE9, that implementation is GlassFish 6. So GlassFish is in that sort of strange position at the moment, in that it's the only implementation, except maybe Pyara, that implements all the optional pieces. And it's the only implementation that basically can be used at this point in time to release the platform. So we have a bit of a chicken and egg situation. To release the platform spec, we need an implementation that has all the optional pieces. Currently, the only one that does that is GlassFish, and therefore we need to get GlassFish 6 out at the same time as specifications. So a lot of my work really has been about ensuring that GlassFish 6 is ready at the same time as this Jakarta E9 release. And the reason that we're heavily involved is obviously Pyara is a basically forked from GlassFish a few years back, but that does mean we know a lot about the code base, and therefore we can spend a lot of time converting it and moving it over into the Jakarta namespace using the basic Pyara knowledge. So the Pyara team's been pretty heavily involved in pushing out the GlassFish 6.0. So as I said, just to summarize where its role is, so it's one of compatible implementations, but it's currently the one that's getting used to get many of the specifications to ballot. So it's not just the platform spec, which is obviously the big one, which is the whole of Jakarta EE9. It's also used to ballot things like EJB, Jakarta concurrency, Jakarta connectors. They're all implemented in GlassFish. Jakarta security. Many of these specifications use GlassFish as the initial compatible implementation, so they can get proof, as I said from the previous slide, that the TCK they've created can be tested and can be run in a real implementation. I mean, that's a key bit of the Jakarta process, is that you can prove that the specification you've created and the TCKs you've tested actually work against a real thing. So GlassFish is that real thing we're using today. So as I said, GlassFish implements all the optional components, but otherwise it isn't special. It's not the normative implementation, as it was previously. Okay. So how do we build it? So GlassFish is built from many, many things. So when we set out to build version 6, we obviously needed to change all our code to use the Jakarta namespace. And then we needed to bring in many different components. So this is a sort of view of, a very simplified view of the dependency chart that has GlassFish. So GlassFish itself, the project, is just the core server. So there are other projects that we depend upon within EE4J and externally. For example, on the bottom half of the picture, there's a whole bunch of projects that aren't really Jakarta EE that GlassFish depends on, something called Shoal, which is clustering implementation, HK2, which is dependency injection. We still got dependencies on the Corba orb, which was also an EE4J project, separate to GlassFish. We have Grizzly for networking, and then Woodstock and JSF templating, which are part of the administration console. And then we have, in yellow, all the APIs that we depend upon. These are obviously the actual Jakarta APIs. So that's not all of them. And then, given the APIs, we also then have implementations of each one of these APIs. So, for example, we have an internal EJB implementation. There's Metro, which is an external project which does the web services. Jersey that does REST. Mahara does JSF, etc. And then we have things like Weld, which is a JBoss project, not in the Eclipse Foundation, which is our Jakarta CDI implementation. And we also have Eclipse Link, which is a big separate project, which is Jakarta Persistence. So the approach we had to do to build GlassFish, it actually took quite a long time, not because of the technical complexity involved, but because of the dependencies involved. So if you can imagine, the approach we took first was to basically change our dependency to a Jakarta dependency. For example, if we depended on Jakarta REST, then we just updated our dependency in our POM, looked at everything that didn't compile, and then changed the namespace for that. But we also had to wait for Jakarta REST to actually produce a new API release candidate that we could depend on. We also then required Jersey to have implemented that API and moved all their code over to the new namespace before we could bring that into GlassFish codebase. So we basically spent a lot of time coordinating and driving and trying to understand how all these pieces fit together, and a lot of time was spent waiting for other projects to actually release candidates into the staging repo that we could then consume within GlassFish. And to get to a final release, so today we're actually release candidate 2, which is a fully compatible implementation. It passes the TCK, but to get to final, which hopefully we'll do in the next week or so, we need every single one of these other components that we depend upon, which aren't part of our project, to also release final candidates, final jars into Maven Central. So at the moment, as I said, we have a fully compatible implementation with release candidate 2, and that can be used to test out projects and applications. So basically, going to talk a little bit about how you migrate an application to Jakarta EE9 and get it running on GlassFish. So, as I said, GlassFish itself was a really big Jakarta application. So almost all of it depends on the Javax namespace. So we approached it. We didn't do a search and replace, as that can be a bit brutal. So, and there's some subtleties in the namespace changes. For example, Jakarta transaction, some of the APIs are still in the JDK and it's still in the Javax. Well, not for Jakarta transaction, but some of the Javax.transaction APIs are still in the JDK, and some of them are in the Jakarta transaction spec, also in the Jakarta namespace. It's not as easy as a quick search and replace. We actually did this approach sort of more brute force, really, in the sense that as an API arrived into Maven Central or into our staging repository, we essentially switched the dependencies on our POM and then built it, see what the errors were, changed the namespace of the packages, fixed the errors, compiled and repeated. And this was, like I say, a very slow process, not because the actual work was complicated or took much time on an actual sitting at an IDE basis, but because of the coordination and release of dependencies. So first we switched the APIs and then changed all our code base to the new namespace. And then we started adopting the new implementations. So for example, for REST, we'd start looking for release candidates of Jersey that were in the new Jakarta namespace, and then absorbing those into the GlassFish code base. Then we had a lot of problems with OSGI, so we had to fix a lot of OSGI errors. GlassFish server is built on top of an OSGI platform, and we had some OSGI version numbers and issues with names and things, so we had to fix those as well. Once we got the first step was to actually get the thing to compile. Once it compiled, we had to get it to run, and that's when we started hitting OSGI errors. And again, a lot of that was to then work collaboratively with the API and implementation teams to fix those errors on upstream from us. And one of the major things about working in the Eclipse Foundation that I found was actually the level of collaboration was incredibly high across multiple vendors, multiple community members to actually fix and drive changes like this through the project. The next step then is to pass the TCKs. So first there's a whole bunch of standalone TCKs, like CDI, for instance, that you need to pass as a compatible implementation. Again, those pass pretty quickly because in general, the API the implementations of those APIs like Weld, etc., would have had to pass those standalone TCKs to work. And then you have to pass the platform TCK. And the platform TCK is a little bit more complicated because that's sort of testing interaction between different specifications, and you basically need to run it, see what happens, see if you pass, look at any failures, and start basically working out where the failure occurs. Does it occur in our GlassFish code base, or does it occur in an upstream component that we're pulling in? So that's how we approached it. GlassFish is probably one of the biggest applications that would have to migrate to the new namespace. I actually thought it was, from a technical perspective, quite easy to do. From a time perspective, it took a long time because we were obviously tracking APIs as they appeared and implementations as they appeared. If you're migrating your own application after today, then obviously all those APIs are in Maven Central, and you don't have to wait for them to turn up. So from experience from moving GlassFish, I think the actual experience for application developers will actually be quite small, because there's no real behavior changes moving from one to the other. Then actually the code changes will be quite small. So to migrate your application, all you really need to do is switch to the latest 9 platform BOM, fix your compile errors, adopt new deployment descriptors. So the deployment descriptors have all moved to the new namespace. Now, if you want to be real about this, it's probably not that important if you're using GlassFish to move to the new deployment descriptors, because it supports both old and new, because it actually doesn't really care too much what namespace the deployment descriptors are in. And then you just deploy and see what happens. So I'm going to attempt to show that and do a quick demo. So I've got a very simple application. We've got Maven POM, we've got Jakarta platform, API versions currently at 8.0.0.0. Obviously, this is a small application. It's in the JAVX namespace. And what I'm going to do is build it. And then also deploy it into GlassFish. So I've got the GlassFish administration console here. I should have prepared earlier. So we've built a WAR file. And now the surprising thing is, if I can get this to work. I don't know why it's taking so long, is that this application will actually deploy, but it won't be deployed correctly. And the reason for that is basically GlassFish no longer knows anything about the JAVX namespace. So I can actually take that WAR file in the old namespace and deploy it. Okay, it deploys without any problems. And the reason is as I said, GlassFish doesn't know anything about the JAVX namespace anymore. So if I actually click on it, I'll try to make this a bit bigger. It hasn't detected any of the REST components, any of the servlets, or any of the pieces that were actually deployed that you've got as Jakarta JAVX components, for example. It doesn't see that there's a Hello World servlet there. And see, the reason is it knows nothing about the JAVX namespace. So that class now is literally just like any other class. So it doesn't detect it as a servlet. It doesn't detect the web servlet annotation. So if I need to convert this application, I just go to the POM, change that to version 9. Save that, and I'll get a whole bunch of compilation errors. And then really you're just changing these to Jakarta. Simple as that. You could obviously do it cut and paste, search and replace, but there are some subtleties, especially around transaction API. So if I save that, it should compile now. We literally did that through the whole GlassFish code base, not totally manually, but not with a straight search and replace. So that should be in the new namespace. If I go into my applications, undeploy this one, deploy new WAR. So that one deploys. And the difference now is you can see that it's detected there's a JAX RS and it's detected that there's a servlet. So so that essentially will now run, and if I can remember the URL. So that's a Jakarta E9 application, not a very exciting one. It's just a default one that NetBeans creates for me. But you can see the only real difference is moving the namespace. There's nothing harder than that. This one, for example, doesn't have any webinf web.xml, so there's no need to move that. If you could, as I said, move that to the new Jakarta namespace. But for GlassFish, it's not really that necessary. It's the right thing to do, but GlassFish is pretty. All it really wants to do is to parse that XML. So as long as it parses correctly, then it will run it. So it's not too sensitive for the namespace change, because the elements are all the same as in Jakarta EE8 between Jakarta EE8 and Jakarta EE9. So that is a very, very simple demo of migrating an application. It doesn't take that long. Depending on your code, obviously you can have a lot of namespace changes, but nothing as big as GlassFish had when we changed all that code base. And it should only take as long as it takes to replace those imports and change a couple of namespace declarations. So where we are now, what's next? Next is GlassFish 6 Final. As I said earlier, what we've released to date is release candidate 2. RC2 is the one that is the compatible implementation used to release Jakarta E9. It passes all the TCKs, all the standalone TCKs as well, and the platform CTS. And that's available for download on the Eclipse website. The only difference between GlassFish 6 Final and the RC2 is that we're still waiting for a couple of implementations to push their final versions out into Maven Central. And that'll happen in the next week or two. We're still waiting for CDI weld and Hibernate beam validation and JBatch. Everything else is there now in final. Those others are in release candidates, so they're fine to use. But the next step for us is to get 6 out in a final version, but that's the only difference. So you feel free to download RC2. It's pretty complete. After GlassFish 6, we have got GlassFish 6.1. This targeting Jakarta 9.1, and I don't know if anyone's talking about that yet, but that's really going to move Jakarta EE so that you can run the TCK on Java SE 11, and we will be bringing GlassFish 6.1 up to run on SE 11. It doesn't currently. The biggest difference really is that some of the Jakarta specifications had to be moved because they were dropped from SE 8. For example, the XML web services, Corba and things have been dropped from between SE 8 and SE 11, and we just need to pick those pieces up. And after sort of Jakarta 9.1, which will probably happen sometime early in 2021, we're then starting to look towards Jakarta EE 10. So basically, Jakarta EE 10 is where we're looking at. We've done all the work to migrate from Java EE to Jakarta EE. Jakarta EE9 will be in the new namespace. It's equivalent to Jakarta EE8, which is equivalent to Java EE8, just in the new namespace. Now we're starting to look at how we can improve and drive forward EE10. See, these are some of the things that have come out recently from surveys about what people would want from Jakarta EE10. And from a GlassFish perspective, I imagine we're still likely to be required to push out Jakarta EE10 so that we are the first compatible implementation. That may not happen. Another implementation may need to come along, and that's perfectly fine. You need to have all optional pieces, as I said earlier. So I imagine unless we sort of own a lot of optional components out of 10, that GlassFish 7 or something will need to be the compatible implementation. So there's a lot of opportunity now to jump in, get involved, and actually drive forward what all the things that we wanted to improve as we move Jakarta EE forward. So these are things that have been on the wish list. These are things that have, we in the Payara team want, and will be, assisting to build within GlassFish 7. So, we're looking at driving forward alignment with CDI, looking to work across specifications to give single bean model, make REST, make the REST annotations, bean defining, all those things that are sort of in the mix, really, to make it a more, consistent platform. There's work around how we work with microprofile and how we support microservices, which we already can support, but works with microprofile and some of the APIs there. And then obviously things around cloud native, whether we need to change deployment model, reactive APIs, is basically anything that we need to start thinking about how we drive innovation forward. And a lot of that will happen in the individual projects, in the individual specification projects, how they want to improve themselves, and what they want to introduce. It's a much more diffuse group where they have some autonomy in how they want to drive forward their specifications, and then how that fits across a whole platform. And the GlassFish team will really be there to do that integration work, as I showed in the slide, where we depend on all these APIs and all these implementation projects. Our job really is like an integration hub to make sure that all those things can work together, and get the releases out before, at the same time as the platform specification is released. So that's all I've got. I've got time for questions. I've left, how long have I left? I've left like 8 minutes for questions. So is there any questions?
Hi there, Steve. So I don't see any questions in the chat, actually. So, there are 2 ones. I'll read them for you. Okay. So the question is, what do you do if your application is using legacy jars or submodules that have JavaX namespace somewhere down the path, and you don't have control of that, like some of your dependencies, I guess?
Yeah. So that's one of the problems that's going to arise, and we had that in GlassFish. So, for example, we had to cut out something called fighterfish, which was an OSGI component of GlassFish that deployed OSGI bundles, and that obviously still depended on JavaX servlet. So we had to cut fighterfish out until OSGI moves. When it comes to GlassFish, that's going to be a problem. When it comes to other vendors like Payara, then there is basically going to be the Eclipse transformer project.
So are you planning on incorporating the transformer in Payara, so you can basically deploy a JavaX based application on it, or do I have to transform my application before I deploy it?
Yeah, I mean, for us as a Payara, I've got actually a slide in the keynote. So we're going to detect Jakarta namespace applications and run them through the transformer as part of the deployment step, and then actually deploy those. So they will basically, the Eclipse transformer project is on the fly transforming pieces into the new namespace. Okay. Initially, we're going to do it the other way around. So we'll detect new namespace and transform it into the old. But then later on, we will be native EE9, and then we'll do it the other way around. So we'll do 8 to 9. Okay, for GlassFish, yeah. I don't know if we're incorporating anything like that.
No. So there was another question about if there is any plans to add a caching specification. I guess it's not directly
not a GlassFish thing.
GlassFish question, but you're involved there as well. So like Jcache is hanging around there, and
yeah. So Jcache is not under our control because Jcache is still in the JCP, as far as I'm aware. I would be supportive of it being moved, and incorporated into EE9, not EE9, into a later EE release. However, there's actually a lot of work to do on that because it's an SE specification, so it doesn't cover a lot of the sort of EE B models and things like that. Or we create a new one.
Yeah. You mentioned you're in the keynote later, so you're actually appearing in a roundtable talk later today, where you're going to discuss future Jakarta EE10 and etc. And you're also in vendor keynote.
That's right. So the roundtable is specifically for those sort of questions, isn't it? I haven't been told what the questions are, so I assume they are whatever anybody wants to ask.
Yeah. So if you didn't get to ask your question here, then save it for later and ask it to Steve Dunn in the roundtable.
Yeah, and Aaron's put a message to say the transformer can actually use Maven plugins to transform, and I think that's correct as well. So
okay, so then you can actually, when you build your application, use a transformer plugin and get it to any namespace, and you can go back and forth. So like you said, you could take a Jakarta-based application and transform it to JavaX and then run it on an older runtime.
Yeah, I think basically we'll have a load of tools to do this, and they'll either be built in the product, built in the tool chain, or whatever. It's not really, as I said on the talk, it's not a particularly complicated thing to do.
No.
So it's not particularly difficult.
Yeah. So one thing I noticed when I did a transformation of an application in one of the studio sessions earlier, and what when I did that talk, sometimes even earlier than that, I discovered I forgot to update my hello to Jakarta EE message in the database. So I had hello to Jakarta EE 8, and I had to change the database to 9. And, so it could be also that if you have any fully qualified JavaX class names in your data store, that you need to change there as well.
Yeah, I mean, we were playing with because as a tech preview, it's not obviously E9 compatible, and we had a fully qualified name in one of the servlets. So in web.xml, which we should be transforming, but we hadn't got that far yet. But yeah, they've got to be watched, those strings, really, those opaque strings in service definitions or in web.xmls, those things, especially things like for JSF, where people have got JSF servlet filters and things like that, where they put in directly.
And as you said, GlassFish isn't very picky about the XML namespaces, but other implementations may be. So it's always a good thing to update to the latest version in case there are changes. So for these versions, they're not doing it, but if there are changes, then you can have IDE support by having the namespace there. Exactly. Validated schema.
Part of EE9 is to make the IDEs sort of step up and start using that tooling to actually move, because that's the obvious place to do the tooling to transform an application. I mean, we didn't make GlassFish wasn't picky already on the namespaces, so we didn't want to make it more picky than it was already. So it doesn't validate namespaces during its parsing, so it's quite happy to take anything.
Yeah. There's a third question coming in now, and that is GlassFish 6 already running on JDK 11? And I think you touched about that in your talk. So.
No, 6.1 will do.
Yeah, but it's just around the corner.
Yeah, there's already a branch, you see. So if anyone wants to contribute to the branch, I'm sure we'll be happy.
Yeah. So I guess we're running out of time, and any last minute questions? Otherwise, we will stop this stream and turn it over to Tanya in the next, where we're going to meet the program committee.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.